This is Vivian from PharmaSalon. Before you watch, I want to let you know that if you're interested in getting a CE credit for this video, go to the show notes below. There's a link to the Compounding CE website that will take you directly to the quiz for this class. The show notes also include the questions on the quiz, so be sure to check them out. While you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel.
I am looking forward to speaking with you about environmental monitoring, specifically for ISO Class 8 environments. So I don't have any conflicts of interest or anything to disclose, and we can get into the learning objectives here. So what we're looking to do in this particular session is for you to be able to describe the limitations of viable air and surface sampling. And even though we want to focus on that ISO Class 8 environment, it's important for you to understand kind of all the ins and outs of EM as a whole. Also should be able to identify valuable air and surface sampling locations in the ISO Class 5 or the ISO Class 8 ante-room. We're going to spend a lot of time kind of talking through that. And then you should also be able to discuss the important aspects of investigating and remediating exceeded action levels in that ISO Class 8 area. I want to start out though with some sources of truth, and really all these are the documents that you want to go to look for direction. Some of them are USP chapters that are enforceable. Others are USP chapters that are there for information only. So they have that kind of knowledge that you're going to need to better understand what you need to do in order to comply with USP 797. So we see USP 797 listed there. Also listed is USP 1116, which will cover kind of everything you would want to know about environmental monitoring, but it is specific to aseptic manufacturing environments. So you got to go into it understanding that, hey, this is not going to be exactly for me from a sterile compounding standpoint, but it's going to get me a lot of good information. Then you have USP 1117, which is a microbiological best practice or laboratory practices. And this is going to give you a lot of information in regards to what the lab would be doing from an incubation standpoint. Also important here would be CETA's CAG 009, so that covers information on environmental monitoring. And the FDA's aseptic processing guidance is also a helpful document to take a look at. All right, so I wanted to define EM before we get too far along here. So when we talk about EM or environmental monitoring, this is really a microbiological evaluation of a controlled environment. Now, EM can be done for other things, right? Temperature, humidity, those sorts of parameters. But as we dive into this here, we're going to be talking about EM as it relates to the microbiology piece. So you can see some of the other things there that you might be doing environmental monitoring for within your environment. But as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the bacteria, yeast, and mold that you'll have pop up. And what I want you to do is, as we're talking about this, think about how you currently are documenting your environmental monitoring program, specifically your viable air and surface sampling, because it's going to be really important that you have all of that documented properly. So why do we perform environmental monitoring? Well, we have an environment in which we perform aseptic processing that requires microbiological control. So now we're talking about the primary and secondary engineering controls, and we have to make sure that those are in a state of control. And the only way that we do that is by monitoring the environment. If anything that you walk away from this particular session, I want you to know that EM is not just to check a box. And a lot of organizations kind of fall into that. Well, it's like, well, chapter says we have to do it. We're going to do it. We'll remediate whatever comes up, but we're not going to use it for anything more. And really, environmental monitoring is a tool that's going to provide you information on cleaning, and more specifically, contamination control. How good of a job are staff doing from a garbing and hand hygiene standpoint? What about material transfer? Are they following all the steps that are in place? And also clean room behavior. Because if you end up with excursions in these areas or exceeded action levels, what this will help you do is do an investigation. Once you do an investigation, you find out what you need to change and improve. And ultimately, just doing EM is going to help you with process improvement within your organization. So really, why is this important? Is it's going to facilitate early detection of contamination and its source. And these sources can include personnel garbing practices. This is like a super common one where, getting involved in investigations with sterile compounding pharmacies, that's kind of where we head first, especially when we're seeing a lot of Staphylococcus or Micrococcus show up. Material handling practices, sanitization procedures, supplies and equipment, and then just overall failure of the engineering controls. I want to reiterate here that the viable sampling is the only way to directly monitor the microbial state of control. And this is why doing sampling more frequently than what the chapter is going to require ends up being really important, so you can understand that microbial state of your compounding environment. I do want to kind of review a couple of things here before we get into talking about ISO8 specifically. But what you have to remember is that people compound CSPs, and just by having people within the compounding environment is really going to kind of mean that we're going to have some level of microbial contamination in that space, like no matter what. So even a perfect facility with perfect behaviors is not going to be able to eliminate kind of that shedding of skin particles that is going to come off of personnel. Also important here is that expecting no contamination at all is just not possible, and it's completely unrealistic. We're going to have people in the compounding environment. It means there's going to be microorganisms in that environment, and ultimately that is okay, because it's not whether or not we have an exceeded action level or we've recovered one of those highly pathogenic organisms, it's what we do about it. A couple other reminders here. We're not dealing with a sterile room. And this kind of plays into the fact that we're going to have people in that environment. So there's going to be no way for us to say specifically that, hey, there are not going to be any microorganisms in the ISO class 5, 7, or even 8 environment. And it's not that we're expected to have 0. It's expected that we're having a state of control, which is what we're working towards. And as we talk about more with the ISO class 8, hopefully you'll kind of walk away with understanding like, okay, we have organisms, and that's okay. So some limitations with monitoring, and this is again important, is although EM results should be frequently reviewed to ensure that the compounding environment is operating in that state of control that we're looking for, these EM results can neither prove or disprove sterility of the final CSP. And I've seen environmental monitoring data kind of be used to say, oh, we recovered bugs, product's not going to be any good. And that's not really true. So more goes into it than just saying, okay, microorganisms were recovered, we have to trash all of this. So there's going to have to be some kind of understanding of what else goes on with that environment and what other quality systems are in place. One of the other limitations with EM is that it is not going to be able to, nor does it need to be able to, identify and quantify all microorganisms in the compounding area. This is kind of that quick snapshot in time of what's there when we're sampling. So it's really just giving us kind of this semi-quantitative, because that number of microorganisms is going to fluctuate. It's going to change from, minute to minute, especially in from an air perspective. So when we think about, let's say, your ISO class 8 ante-room, and it has a certain number of air changes per hour, probably around 20, maybe a little bit more, but whatever we recovered in the air at one point in time is going to be different when we sample half an hour later because of those air changes. So other limitations here. The sampling plan itself cannot prove the absence of contamination, even when no microorganisms are recovered. So just because you get zeros on your plates, again, doesn't mean that the bugs were not there. It's just that we didn't happen to find them during that sampling session. Again, just limitation of what we're dealing with here. We're really using 200-year-old science at this point dealing with microorganisms. And look, dealing with living things, it's difficult. It's kind of not any different than like dealing with like toddlers. You kind of can't control what they're doing all the time. What I want you to remember here and walk away with is that we want to find the microorganisms that are present so that we can remediate and maintain that state of control, because ultimately that remediation effort is going to lead to process improvement. And really, that's what we're working towards. I wanted to share an example of what a sampling plan would look like. Specifically, I'd like you to take a look at that ISO class 8 ante-room, as that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on. One of the things that I would suggest and recommend is that you only sample on the clean side of the line of demarcation within that environment. And you'll take notice that there's only one viable air sample marked with that orange diamond on the clean side of that line of demarcation. And we'll talk a little bit more about specific locations a little bit later, but what I want you to kind of think about is we know that the ante-room is going to have microbial contamination. And it's just from the standpoint that we walk in there ungarbed, we do the garbing procedure in there, and then we also have the material transfer that might occur in that area, especially if you don't have pass-throughs and you have to bring everything in through the ante-room. So it's going to be a dirty space. What we want to try to look at, though, is how we are mitigating the migration of that contamination. So if we can focus on what's going on the clean side, and then as we do our other environmental monitoring, specifically in the ISO class 7 buffer room, if we're not seeing that migration from the clean side of the line of demarcation into the buffer room, we've kind of won. Like the buffer or the ante-room is doing what it's supposed to do, which is being a buffer for the buffer room. So microbial contamination in here, it's going to happen, it's going to be there, but we want to kind of find the microorganisms that are going to kind of be the greatest risk based on where they're located. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. What I want to do, though, is share some information on sampling plans and things that you can think about as you're specifically developing a sampling plan overall for your organization. So you want to have a routine sampling plan. And really what that means is that it's a sampling plan that you use every time that you sample. Ideally, you're sampling monthly, but maybe it's not quite that frequently. And it's the same location every time. You're collecting air and surface samples. And as I said, we'd love to see you doing it more frequently, being collected monthly. This kind of happens like during dynamic conditions for the air, but after compounding or kind of in between compounding activities for the surface. And then this data is trended and you have action levels that you apply your data to see whether or not you're meeting where you need to be. That's your routine sampling plan. Now, what I like to share, because people like to know kind of like how good of a job they're doing cleaning. Well, if you want to know how good of a job you're doing cleaning, that should be different sampling than your routine sampling. Because if you think about your routine sampling, that's happening like as people are working and there's a lot going on in that clean room. So now that you've introduced people, you've introduced activity, you're no longer checking on cleaning. At that point, you're checking on how good of a state of control you can maintain during dynamic operating conditions. But if you want to do a little bit more and kind of know about this check on cleaning, it's your same location every time, surface samples collected quarterly, or as defined by your SOP, whatever frequency you want to do, because this is not a chapter requirement. This is going above and beyond. You can do it after cleaning, under static conditions, because we're testing the cleaning, not testing what's going on with activity. Maybe you're going to trend these, maybe not. Totally up to you. It depends on what you want to get out of the information. And then you might have some stricter action levels, or maybe you don't have action levels at all. It's going to be up to you, as this is going to be kind of beyond the chapter. So for where we are right now, are there any questions?
Thanks, Abby. That is really great information. I do have a couple of questions, and
Sure.
I want to start with the sampling plan side. What is the best way to manage 2 sampling plans?
That's a really great question, because by doing these 2 sampling plans, you're kind of, again, as I mentioned, doing more than what the chapter requires. So having that one that is required and is your routine, that's the one that will be shared with the state inspectors, shared with the surveyors. If you're doing these spot checks on cleaning, it could just be something that you manage separately from your routine sampling plan and keep it to the side. It's for your information only, and not something that you're going to really bring out and share with the surveyors or the inspectors, because they don't really need to see that data.
What are people supposed to do about the 1 CFU of mold recovery in the ante-room?
So that's an interesting question, and that kind of will play into some of the things that we'll discuss later through this particular webinar, but this presentation. But the idea here is that we don't overreact to those kinds of things, and we take it in stride with what is actually there, how many, and if it's just the one, is this the first time? Are we recovering the same organism? So we take a look at kind of a lot of aspects there and make some really good decisions based on what the data is telling us. So I think some of that information I'll probably cover a little bit later in the presentation.
Okay. My last question is, with repeat and consecutive excursions, do you need to recall everything prepared since the last passing result?
That's also a really great question. And some of that I'll cover later on as well, specifically with what to do with, hey, we've had multiple excursions in this particular location. Is there something that we need to do more than just maybe, let's say, reducing beyond use staging? So that's also going to be a situational issue when it comes to what they are going to need to be able to do in their organization. But we can definitely get into a little bit more detail on that later on. All right. So as far as really developing a sampling plan, we're going to want to determine locations during the initial startup or the commissioning of a clean room. So if you've gone through construction recently, you got to come up with where you're going to collect those samples. And along with that, you want to do a risk analysis of where you want to collect them. Why do you want to collect them? And getting a rationale for collecting those sampling locations is actually going to be a really good thing. Have documentation as to why you chose the locations that you chose. What I want to point out here is that this is more than letting a vendor, which is typically your certifier, choose for you. So you want to document why you chose the locations based on risk and what goes on within that particular compounding environment. And this is so important that kind of you decide. And the reason is because only you know where to sample in your pharmacy. Sampling must occur in locations that, if contaminated, have a higher probability of adversely affecting the CSPs. So if you kind of really think about it, your certifier can help you to a certain point, but you know where your high touch risk areas are going to be. You know where your back and forth high traffic locations are going to be. Those are locations that you want to make sure end up on your sampling plan. It's important here that we're still following USP 797, what it's going to tell us to do. And it indicates that we need to sample in each ISO classified space and in the segregated compounding area, or the SCA. Now, a special note here, the SCA is required by the 2008 version of the chapter. It's really best practice if you take a look at the 2019 version of the chapter. I'm a big fan of sampling in the SCA just because it gives you a baseline for what's there, not only sampling in your primary engineering control. But as we're looking at the areas for the greatest risk of contamination, it's human activity. What are the entry points of lower classification to higher classification? So do we have pass-throughs that might be a concern from that point? Ingress from, let's say, the ante-room into the buffer realm. Also areas within and around doors and pass-throughs. And then the location of equipment is really something that needs to be considered and how that's going to affect the microorganisms that we're going to see. So now I want to specifically here get into the air samples for the ISO class 8 environment, right? We know that we have to sample in every single ISO classified environment, but let's take a specific look at what we should be doing within that ISO class 8 area. As I mentioned earlier, really consider only sampling on the clean side of the line of demarcation. And one of the things that then I get asked about is, like, I have the note here, it says close to the sink. Well, what does that mean? Well, you don't want to be right on top of the sink. One of the things that we face with how the chapter was written is we have a huge contamination source of a sink on the clean side of the line of demarcation in the anteroom. In some ways, this is kind of setting us up for failure, not so much from exceeding the action level from a count standpoint, but because then the chapter went on to say, hey, if you have gram-negative organisms in your space, you have quote unquote highly pathogenic organisms, which means you must immediately remedy the situation. As many of you are familiar, that turned into you fail, basically, and it presents a real challenge. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if the bugs were there, we want to find them. But at the same time, we already know that we have a huge contamination source in there, and we should just treat it as such. So if you can be within an area to sample that kind of gets you an idea of what could be coming from the sink from a contamination standpoint, but not sampling like on top of the sink, that kind of gets you that balance that you're looking for. Also, if you have a huge anteroom, and you have workstations that are present in there where there are people either sitting garbed or ungarbed, sampling in those locations is also going to provide you for information on how those particular people are impacting the space. Strongly recommend that if you do have workstations and they do happen to be on the clean side, that whoever's hanging out in there is fully garbed. If they're on the dirty side, I'd strongly recommend that even though maybe they haven't crossed over to wash hands, that they still have on the hair, face, and at least a gown to help contain. Now, also you want to consider any area that's going to have higher particle counts, and your certifier can help determine that for you. Really, if you take a look at the certification reports that come through from them, what they do is they'll provide you with the particle counts for the area, right? They have to take so many locations based on the size of your room. And you might actually see some areas that have higher particulate than others. And that might be because of the way that the air moves through your room and where your return grills are. So they might be able to provide you with some insight like, hey, this particular area has a really, really high particle count. You might want to focus on this area from a sampling standpoint. So the last thing then that we want to take a look at too is where your pass-through doors are. So if you have a pass-through that is going to go from the unclassified to the classified space, we want to make sure that that gets included within the sampling plan. Now, when we take a look at the surface samples in the ISO class 8 environment, you have like more choices than you want to even kind of think about. The challenge here, though, is finding those that are going to provide you with the information on the microbial state of control. So some are going to give you better information than others, and this might be a bit of a trial and error to kind of find what is going to work best. But that being said, you want to just make sure that as you're choosing those locations that you're going to stick with them for a period of time. Okay, so other things that we might find in the ante room for an ISO class 8 area that we want to make sure that we incorporate into the sampling plan would be carts and tables. The most important thing here is that you're considering how they are used. So Carts that are going to be used directly outside of primary engineering controls to stage samples or to stage materials, we would sample. But since we're talking about the carts and the tables that are going to live in the ISO class 8 environment, how are they being utilized? If you don't have a pass-through within your organization, you likely have a dirty cart, clean cart system where you bring materials into the dirty side of the line of demarcation and you do your material handling over the line and put them on a clean cart. A great place to take a sample is on that clean cart, because now we can kind of see what was tracked into the space after the material handling process, which hopefully really shouldn't be anything. So if you're finding a lot of organisms there, that could be a spot for concern and an area for improvement. So also too, one of the things that we tend to find is exceeded levels on carts or tables indicate poor sanitization during a work shift. So as you're collecting these during dynamic activity, during a work shift, if you're finding a lot of organisms, it might be that there's not frequent sanitization of the surface during the work shift. And again, that's an area for process improvement. All right, so pass-throughs. You may have a pass-through in your ISO class 8 that is going from the unclassified into the ISO class 8, and then you might have another one then that goes from the ISO class 8 into the buffer room. So if you have these pass-throughs, the 2019 version of the chapter will require that you sample the interior of that pass-through. I would recommend that you go with the bottom of the pass-through because that's where materials are going to be set. So we want to see what bugs are getting transferred on those particular materials. Now, I have the door handle on the pass-through as a maybe. The reason for this would be depending on where that pass-through is located in your ISO8 ante-room, you would have to kind of make a determination of whether or not you want to sample it. If that pass-through lives on the dirty side and goes to the unclassified space, likely people are not going to be wearing gloves in order to reach in. So you're going to have an astronomical number of bugs on there. And that may or may not be a problem depending on your compounding process. So you have to look at that. Then for those that have the pass-through going from the 8 into the buffer room, again, it's looking at your workflow and your practice. So ideally, somebody that is going to be passing something from the ISO class 8 into the buffer room is wearing gloves. If they're wearing gloves and you do still want to see kind of what is existing on that door handle, you can sample there. If they're not wearing gloves, we might need to talk about material handling at that point, because then you're passing microorganisms in, even if you're doing a material handling step. So really look at your work practice and kind of determine what you want to do with the pass-throughs. Refrigerators. Now, this is kind of a tough situation. You may or may not have a refrigerator in your ante-room. You might have one of those beauties that is a pass-through refrigerator that lives between the unclassified and the ante-room, or lives between the ante-room and a buffer room. So again, you need to kind of watch work practices and see how people are using and utilizing this refrigerator. If you have a lot of back and forth to this refrigerator that could directly impact the sterility of the CSP, then by all means, consider taking samples on there so that you can kind of track the movement of those microorganisms. Ideally, if you can avoid having your refrigerator in your ante-room at all, that would be ideal. However, I know some people have that kind of setup. So you can look at sampling on the handle. This particular picture, you're seeing more of a smaller counter height type unit. If people are going to be putting things on there and staging things that are going to ultimately end up in the buffer room and in the primary engineering control, it might be useful to sample the top of that, depending again on how that's going to be used. You might not know that until you go in there and kind of watch how people are actually working. Chairs are another one. So if you have chairs that are set up within the ante-room, kind of watch work practices and see if it's going to make sense to do it. Now, remember, the less stuff that you have in the ante-room, the better, especially from a microbial contamination standpoint. So if they're there, see where staff have the most touch with their hands. Ideally, they're gloved, because if they're not gloved, you're going to, again, have a ton of microorganisms on those surfaces. I wanted to just point this out here because I'm sure you'll run into this situation not only in your ISO class 8, but also in your buffer rooms. And if you have staff that are really, really good at making sure that they're sanitizing their gloves on the in and out of the primary engineering control, you probably don't need to sample this. But if you have staff that struggle with that glove sanitization, this might be a valuable location, at least for a little while, until you kind of get enough data to see what the issue is and get training in place to discontinue that issue from occurring. Now, if we talk again about what ISO class 8 ante-rooms are supposed to do for you, it really should be a place for you to garb and to do other high particulate activities, which would kind of be your material transfer. I have been in some ante-rooms that kind of have a ton of storage and have drawers. Ideally, there are no drawers. Drawers are really, really hard to clean, but it also kind of creates then a unique situation from sampling where it's like, all right, well, if they're in and out of these drawers, do we need to sample these drawers? All I can really say here is you've got to watch work practices and see how that will impact the CSP, but you're likely looking at the handles and the drawer fronts as opposed to sampling on the inside of the drawers. The same note here, if you happen to have drawers in, let's say, your segregated compounding area or your buffer room, again, make sure that those gloves are being sanitized before entering the PEC, because if they are, that location's not really going to be valuable. Then we have the door handles. If your organization has moved to a hands-free system, you don't really have to worry about this at all. I wouldn't sample the doors because nobody should be touching them. However, if you still have that door handle, that manual door that you have to pull open, watch your work practices. Depending on how the door pulls and where you don your gloves, it might be a huge contamination source, at least from the standpoint of if you wash your hands in the ante-room, right, you don your gown and then you don't put gloves on until you get into the buffer room, you touch that handle and open, even though you did a good job washing your hands, you're still going to have microorganisms on that door handle. My question to you would then be, does that matter? Does it really matter if you have microorganisms on the door handle in the ante-room? Especially because anybody re-entering there that maybe have gloves on, before they'd go back in to start compounding again, they're going to be donning new gloves. So again, take a look at how that might impact the space. Nobody should be sampling walls. I like to reserve walls for that cleaning sampling plan that I talked about to check to see, how staff are doing from a cleaning standpoint, or if EVS is doing cleaning for you, how good of a job they're doing. But if for some reason you have some kind of specific work practice where people are frequently touching the wall, which they probably shouldn't be, it's something that you can take a look at it. Again, if they're touching walls before they enter a primary engineering control, you probably need to do some retraining and then also figure out why they're doing it and change work practices so that's not really going to be an issue. All right, this is my favorite one because every so often I still come across sampling on the floor. And unless you're compounding on the floor, you can skip sampling on the floor, especially in the ante-room. So that ISO class 8 ante-room, definitely on the dirty side of the line of demarcation, is going to be loaded with microorganisms. Should be less on the clean side, but this is also why the chapter requires cleaning the floor daily so that we're mitigating that risk of those microorganisms, that are present on the floor. All right. Sinks and benches. These things exist in our ISO class 8 environments, so let's take a look at these. I'd like to start talking with this kind of again in that mindset of like, all right, what's the risk to the final CSP if we have microorganisms on these surfaces? Well, if you have staff that put things on the garbing bench that will ultimately end up in the primary engineering control, you might want to sample the bench. But first, you'd want to change that work practice, because really the only thing that should be going on the bench is somebody's backside. So we're going to say, look, not really going to be a valuable place for you to sample. Now, from the sink standpoint, right? This is a freestanding sink. Makes it kind of difficult to kind of sample around it. But if you have a sink that's incorporated into a countertop and like a long counter, and you know what that sink looks like, right? They're splashing and they're spraying and there's water all over the place. If, again, you put things down on that counter that will eventually be carried into the buffer room, sampling on that sink might be valuable for you in the short term, but it's not something that we'd want to keep long term, because we'd rather have you change work practices where people don't put things next to that sink and have a different place. So if you take a look at this image, I have the shelf above as a maybe. Does something get dropped on there? Is that a place where somebody will put, you know, pens or papers or something that's going to go into the buffer room? Maybe we're going to sample there. But please, 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 as I mentioned before, huge contamination risk. Please don't sample inside the sink. I guarantee you are going to have a ton of microorganisms, even with cleaning the sink daily, and we're going to have those gram-negative bugs. But this is also why the 2019 chapter talks about cleaning the sink daily, so we're mitigating the risk from those microorganisms. So USP is kind of trying to help you out with those contamination sources in that ISO class 8 ante-room. So we're kind of working through that a little bit. Okay. So now we had some questions about excursions a little bit earlier, and I want to kind of circle back to talk about what we're going to do if there are excursions. Now, I like to kind of categorize these as first-time excursions and then consecutive and repeat excursions. So it's not something that you see in the chapter described that way, and I'll walk you through what that means, but we want to kind of talk through what to do if you do have excursions in your ISO 8 environment. So from an air sampling standpoint, you want to resample under dynamic conditions, right? We want to kind of get that sample taken again. There's people working. What are we really recovering? As part of your investigation, which you're required to do by the chapter, you want to note the persons who performed the last cleaning, as well as those working in the area during sampling. Start collecting data, right? When we're doing these investigations, we're like, you know, detectives trying to figure out what happened and why. So this is now kind of back to that question that was asked earlier. All right, the ante-room, what if I get mold in there? Is that a big deal? What I want you to understand is that that ante-room is the only space where a low level of fungal growth is expected. And this would hold true for ISO class 7 ante-rooms as well. So you're gonna likely see mold growth in there, even if it's a 1 or 2 CFU. And the reason for that is, think about how, you know, your staff enter the space. Do you don dedicated shoes to the building? Do you don hospital laundered or facility laundered dedicated scrubs? If not, you're likely bringing in mold all the time on people's clothing, people's shoes, possibly even hair. So we're likely going to bring in 1 or 2 mold spores when we enter that space, no matter what. Also, the cleanliness of the area outside of the ISO class 8 ends up being important as well, or the ISO class 7 ante-room. So keeping that area clean is going to help minimize some of that risk of the kind of transient mold that is going to enter. And the reason that, again, I don't really totally freak out about mold in the ante-room, especially if it's one CFU every once in a while or two CFU every once in a while, is that if you're not seeing those organisms make their way into the buffer room or into the ISO5 PEC, you've won the game. The ante-room has done its job, which is meant to be for high particulate activity and to remove those risks from further migrating into the compounding space. All right, so that was a long answer to the one CFU of mold in the ante-room, but do you have to react to it based on the current chapter? Yes, but it's not the end of the world. Now, as far as surface samples go, if you have an excursion, so you've exceeded the action level or you have one of those highly pathogenic organisms for the first time in a particular area in your ante-room, what you want to do is resample towards the end of the first shift under dynamic conditions. So just kind of get a feel for what we're seeing. Again, make sure that you're noting the people who had done the last cleaning and who are working in there so that we have all of that captured. Ultimately, what you're going to end up doing is taking a look at those results and then seeing what you get back. If you're back within a state of control, it might have just been that one blip, no big deal. You know, you took a couple steps maybe to mitigate additional risk and it's all documented, you're done, you move on. Not that big of a deal. Now, as far as looking at what I like to call these consecutive and repeat excursions, we're going to have some different steps that we're going to take here. So this is not in the chapter. This is a way that I like to define these excursions so they kind of make sense and you can figure out what the right next steps are. So I define a consecutive excursion when a location has back-to-back excursions, whether or not it's an exceeded action level or that organism of concern, as I prefer to call it. And it's kind of, you sampled, you got this organism, you sampled again, you got the organism. So that's consecutive. When I say repeat, this is when a location has an excursion again. So either that organism of concern or an exceeded action level, but they're not consecutive, right? So maybe you sampled in June and you had an exceeded action level. You resampled, things got back on track. July, August, September all looked good. And now that same location is exceeded again in like October. So we're repeating at the same location, which is something that you want to make sure that you're trending. So what do we do if we have these consecutive or repeat excursions? So starting with the consecutive excursions. So for the ante-room, and this could be an ISO class 7 or an ISO class 8, you want to look at, you know, your BUD situation. If it's in the air, you could, and I'm saying you could go to a 12-hour BUD, but it really should be based on the excursion. So if you had one mold recovered in the ante-room and then you sampled again, you still have one mold recovered in the ante-room, probably don't need to drop the BUD at this point. Especially if you do some resampling in the buffer room and the primary engineering control and you're not seeing any migration, okay? For surfaces, I would tell you to kind of evaluate the situation again. Maybe you would consider a 12-hour beyond use date, but that's not always like the first place to go because I really don't consider you know, even maybe 2 consecutive excursions to say that you definitively have a trend that you're out of, you know, compliance at this point. So more data is better. Things that you want to make sure that you do, though, is really ensure that staff are appropriately trained and go back and dig to make sure that there are no issues with adherence to contamination control procedures. So everybody is following all of the garbing requirements. People have good clean room behavior, slow movements, not excessively talking, not bringing cell phones in, right? And that people are also following all the material handling procedures. So depending on what you're seeing from an organism standpoint, you want to gear your investigation to that. If you think that the issue is related to the performance of the ante-room, you want to contact your certifier. But most of the time, it is not a facility issue, it's a people and behavior issue. So make sure you start your investigation there. Then you want to get resampled after you go through appropriate corrective actions. And I recommend doing more than just the resampling the spot that had the exceeded level. If you can take more samples in that ante-room, great. Do a couple in the buffer room to make sure things aren't migrating either. So you're trying to kind of gauge where you are. Now, I want to make sure that we talk a little bit here, though, about these repeat excursions. And this is something that you would have to determine the actions that you want to take. So depending on the length of time that would be between the excursion and the organism recovered, you might decide that you're going to treat this as a first-time excursion or a consecutive excursion. So as I mentioned, these repeat would be something like it exceeded in June and you didn't exceed again until October. Do you want to treat that as the brand new first-time excursion? And it might make sense to do so, especially if maybe the first time it was for 1 CFU of mold in your ISO8, and the next time now it's because you had 120 CFU of Staphylococcus. So although the site is exceeded both times and it's the same location that failed, you have different organisms recovered and different counts, and likely the source of those two excursions are going to be completely different. So something like that, it would make sense to kind of treat them as separate first-time excursions. Now, what you could do, though, is if it was mold in June, 1 CFU, and now you're seeing the same mold, but you have 10 CFU in October, that might warrant you doing a consecutive excursion, which kind of means you reopen that past investigation and go back, see what was there, kind of run through everything again, and make sure that you have crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's on what you implemented from a corrective action from the first time is still effective. So that's kind of the breakdown of everything that we want you to think about from that consecutive excursion and the repeat excursion standpoint. So that kind of wraps up everything that I had from the lesson and the presentation information. So as far as looking at some of the questions related to this, what is the best way to determine the number of samples to collect? A, use the table in ISO 14644-1 based on the square footage of the room. Allow the sampling vendor to choose based on their experience. Set up a grid pattern and sample every 3 feet, or perform a risk assessment. Okay. And the correct answer based on what we discussed would be to perform a risk assessment. And a lot of that was kind of covered from, what gets touched, how do people move, what is the process flow? So it's really going to be important to step back and assess all of the things that could impact that final CSP. The next question is why is it important to review past data of the entire room where the excursion occurred as part of the investigation? And it's A, the whole area may be trending out of control and not just a particular location. B, it will determine if the person doing the sampling is the cause of the excursions. C, cleaning may be insufficient based on the recovered microorganisms. And D, past data may identify potential issues with the HVAC system. And based on what we talked about here, the whole area may be trending out of control and not just a particular location. So it's important to take a look back at all of the data that you have, especially if you can, when you're doing your resampling, not just collect the location that had not passed, but looking at some of the other areas as well. And the last question is, what is a limitation of viable sampling? A, it can only be used for release testing of final sterile preparations. B, microorganisms recovered will not be viable for identification. C, microorganisms may be present but were not found. Or D, it can only provide qualitative data. And based on, again, what we had talked about, one of the limitations is that microorganisms may be present, but were not found. And this is very typical and common. Just remember, just because you don't recover them doesn't mean that they're not there. All right, so thank you for your time. I've enjoyed reviewing environmental monitoring in the ISO Class 8 environment with you.
Thank you, Abby. That was great. Very comprehensive. One of the reasons that I like having consultants is because you see so many different things. And I'm wondering if there are any stories that you have that illustrate some of the problems that you've seen and how that they've corrected it.
Yeah, one of the big ones, they had some water damage and had me come in because they thought that the mold that they were recovering in their ante-room was based off of this water damage. And we were also seeing that mold show up in some of the other rooms as well. And being able to go in and take a look at the facility, they had one of the large pass-through refrigerators that actually it went from the ante-room into the unclassified space, and it wasn't sealed properly. So there was a lot of air going back and forth between the unclassified space and the ante-room. And there was a lot of then dirt and debris and dust build up in that area because of that. And we traced their excursions back to that particular issue with the refrigerator. And I think one of the biggest things that people need to do is really take a look at their environment and kind of look at it through a different lens, right? Because you're in there all the time, every day, and it's like, oh, things are good. But you really want to step back and kind of put on that detective hat and look at all of the things that might actually cause, issues or contamination risks.
Would that tie into, we've been talking a lot about audits or not audits, but a lot of process and procedures. And the advice that I'm always hearing is, take a proper walkthrough. So would you saying pretend that you are an auditor and that you need to walk through and almost look at it from somebody else's point of view and sort of see, just kind of like you said, put on and just look at it from a different angle or as if you were somebody else and look at what the contamination areas might be?
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes that can be scary doing that and walking through. And I think that's why some people kind of are hesitant to do that, afraid of what they're going to actually find. But ultimately, no matter what you happen to see, if it's a risk from a contamination standpoint or just kind of some other process that's not being done properly, at the end of the day, this is all for improvement to ensure that the patients are going to have a safe medication. So, taking that time to really step back and look at that is going to be important. And as you said, if you can go through there kind of almost with an inspector mindset, that's really going to help from a process improvement standpoint.
Okay, excellent. I know there have been some proposed changes to 797, and I'm sure that we'll talk about this a little bit more. But is there any proposed changes that directly affect what you were just talking about?
So not specifically. We didn't really talk about frequency of sampling, except kind of generally that love to see more sampling. But one of the things that people will want to be aware of is that if you're going to be preparing what the 2021 now revision mentioned of category 3 CSPs, you do have requirements for more frequent air and surface monitoring. So viable air sampling would need to be done on a monthly basis and surface sampling would be done weekly.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks.
Thank you for watching. Remember, if you would like ACPE credit for this lecture, click on the link below and register for the class. You won't have to watch the video again, just answer the quiz questions. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can be updated on all our latest content.